So when we left Mexico in and around the year 1824, after the overthrow and execution of one-time Mexican Emperor Augustin de Iturbide, Mexico was a hot mess. And I would love to tell you that it's about to get less messy, but in fact, it's about to get a lot messier because the basic division between what we will call conservatives and liberals in Mexico haven't gone away. So conservatives tend to support the privileges of the Catholic Church, support the old class system that we've seen in Mexico dating all the way back to the Spanish conquest. Liberals want to basically recognize social equality. They want more rights for Native Americans, and they think that the church, which owns over half the productive land in Mexico, is a roadblock for modernization and development. In 1824, Mexico creates a constitution that makes Mexico a federal system, not unlike that of the United States. Even though it has a federal system, it still largely ignores the legal status of Native Americans. It dodges the whole question of land distribution. There are still massive educational problems and a problem of widespread impoverishment. So from 1832 to 1835, you have liberal federalists in control of the government, and there's a lot of friction between them and the church. This actually leads to violence. And a lot of these civil disturbances lead to Mexico being seen as easy pickings by many of the foreign powers of the world, particularly a neighbor to the north, the United States of America. In 1835, many American-born citizens of the Mexican province of Tejas launch a revolution designed to basically overthrow Mexican state control. The Tejas revolutionaries take heavy casualties at first, but manage to win a surprising victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, which forces the Mexican president at the time, Juan Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, to basically recognize that Texas is independent. Now, the Mexican government repudiates that. In other words, they say that no, actually, Tejas or Texas is still a province of the Mexican state, but they take no steps to really go and try to reconquer it, reasoning that it already had enough on its plate at this point. So this is a weird situation where Tejas or Texas now claims to be independent, and Texas apparently is eager to be annexed as an American state by the United States of America. In 1845, the United States government votes to annex Texas, and wouldn't you know it, in 1846, we have the Mexican-American War. Now, this is not actually a one-sided war. Mexico has a ton of advantages, but the advantages that the Americans have are advantages in things like military technology and industry, the ability to send troops over long distances. And so because of those advantages, the United States ultimately proves victorious. In the course of the war, the United States manages to occupy the capital of Mexico City, and the Mexican government is more or less forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives up over half of all Mexico's territory, and it could have been worse. There were some in Washington that actually wanted all of Mexico to be absorbed as an American state. But the politics over the expansion of slavery, which is a whole can of worms you'll get to next year, basically leads Congress to decide on only taking half. Only half. Now, this also takes, about 5% of the Mexican population. The huge loss in the war forces Mexico's political class to confront the problems that had long plagued Mexican society. This culminates in 1854 to 1855 with the La Reforma, which is a liberal revolution led by this guy right here, one of the most important individuals in Mexican history, by the name of Benito Juarez. So Benito Juarez and La Reforma, they want to limit the power of the military and the church, and they try to create, or their vision is Mexico to be a society of small independent farmers that is based on equality. Their slogan is land and liberty, and they limit the privileges of traditional groups like the huge landowners and the priests. And remember that oftentimes during this period, that's actually one and the same category. So in 1857, Juarez is elected president, and he creates, under his leadership, he creates a new constitution. And again, the goal here is to create a nation of small independent farmers. Juarez is interesting because he is not of the Criollos class. Basically, Mexican politics have been dominated by these people of European descent. Juarez was a Zapotec Native American. He received a legal education and became the governor of the province of Oaxaca, or the state of Oaxaca. And he has a vision of a liberal secular society in which basically both the church and the army would be eliminated entirely, which was radical then, and certainly for some seems radical even today. So with the French Revolution, we saw this seesawing back and forth between both ends of the political spectrum. France was a republic until it was an empire, and then it was a monarchy, and then it becomes a republic. And basically that's Mexican history as well. You see this seesawing back and forth between political extremes. So Juarez is pushing for liberal measures, the isolation of the church, that kind of thing. But in 1857, basically the Catholic Church announces that all those who signed the Constitution or supported the Constitution of 1857 would be excommunicated. So this leads to a civil war. Now, Juarez is on the up and up. And because conservatives were losing the war, they basically are looking everywhere for some potential help. And they settle on an individual who was hungering for military glory, one Napoleon III of France. So Napoleon III considered himself to be a liberal. However, he's kind of in a bind. One is that he had helped liberate a huge chunk of Italy, and in the process had alienated the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For good reason, he wanted to assure that Austria-Hungary would basically stay neutral in the event France would have to go to war with the Kingdom of Prussia. Again, not necessarily an incorrect assumption. So he looks for a way to basically do the Habsburg family a solid, and he reasons that if he takes Emperor Franz Josef's brother, Maximilian von Habsburg, and he gives him a kingdom of his own, then basically Austria-Hungary will owe him a favor. So the French send an expeditionary force to Mexico to back Maximilian von Habsburg, and they place him on the throne as the Emperor of Mexico, and it creates the Second Mexican Empire. Theoretically, Mexico is an independent state. I mean, empires almost always are, but in fact, France views Mexico as a potential colony and a place to basically extract resources. So in other words, they're just trying to take this place that Spain used to occupy. Now, Napoleon thinks this move is going to be widely popular since the Habsburgs have royal connections to basically every family in Europe. But in fact, he basically almost alienates everybody. The United States actually sends an army to the Rio Grande, in other words, the Mexican border, sort of threatening or signaling its displeasure. It also angers both conservatives and liberals. Conservatives, even, at this point, they don't want Mexico to be a colony. So basically, the only reason that Maximilian von Habsburg is in power is because of the presence of the French army. So eventually the French army is actually defeated by basically the opposition forces. And in 1867, Maximilian is captured and actually executed. So Emperor Maximilian has kind of a bad day. Now, that execution is used to send a message that basically, well, just to put it in the modern vernacular, Fafo, if if you mess with Mexico, well, that's what you're going to get. So Juarez comes back to office, and Mexico reverts back to a republic because of how symbolically important he was and because he's on the winning side. Basically, Juarez has no checks on his power and he becomes very autocratic. One of the things that we're going to see with the Mexican political system is the presidents sometimes wield almost dictatorial power. And following in that tradition, we have one of the victorious military commanders in the war, Porfirio Diaz. Fun fact, Porfirio Diaz was a military commander who defeated the French army at the Battle of Puebla in 1862, which allowed for the liberation of Mexico City. This victory was so decisive that it becomes a national holiday by the name of Cinco de Mayo. But other than this achievement, Juarez, his successor, Diaz, basically becomes a dictator in all but name. He at least pays lip service to democracy, but basically under his rule, Mexico becomes kind of an oligarchy. So you see lots of rapid economic growth. Mexico becomes open to industrialist and foreign businesses. So American robber barons, like, for example, John D. Rockefeller, can open businesses and facilities in Mexico. So you see lots of economic growth. Unfortunately, it's just not a lot of economic growth that trickles down to the rest of the population. The peasants in general do not prosper. So once again, we see sort of the seesaw sort of go back to the other I can't use seesaw verbs. We see the pendulum swing back, basically. And basically, the people who become the real power in Mexico, other than Diaz, are his appointed officials called the científicos, who are supposed to basically make policies that are based on science and positivism, excuse me. And they're trying to turn Mexico into an industrial nation. But again, the fact is that this economic revolution leaves the peasantry behind, and this leads to yet another very violent civil war called the Mexican Revolution of 1910. But that is a story for another time. Sorry, Max. Sorry, dude. Look at this guy. He just looks bored.